With the Buddhist Sutras in hand, Fa Xian began his voyage back to China. But facing stormy weather and rough seas, would he survive the voyage home? In the year 409 AD, Fa Xian travelled south to Sri Lanka in search of a port where he could start his journey back to China. However, this being a Buddhist island, he ended up coming across many rare Buddhist texts. In order to study and transcribe these classics, Fa Xian decided to stay in Sri Lanka, even though at the time he was already 72 years old. He began to study and copy the texts day and night, and he prayed for the time and energy he needed to transcribe these words imparted by Lord Buddha, as well as for their safe passage to China. In the year 411, Fa Xian finally completed the copying of the Buddhist precepts he had found at Abhayagiri Vihara in Sri Lanka. He now had the complete sutras in hand. He had endured 12 years of challenging travel. His journey to the West had finally come to an end. But Fa Xian wasn't happy. The reason was, he'd been abroad for far too long, and he missed China. Thinking about those who had accompanied him on this long journey, and those who had died along the way, weighed heavily on his mind. One day, when Fa Xian saw a merchant make an offering of a Chinese silk fan in a shrine at the monastery, he started to cry. This was the third time he had wept on his westward journey. But this time, he wasn't crying for his colleagues who had passed away or the decline of Buddhism. He was crying because he was homesick.
佛法也已求到，该是我回家的时候了。
In August of 411 AD, a ship set out on the Indian Ocean in an eastward direction. 74-year-old Fa Xian stood on the deck and watched the Indian subcontinent he was leaving behind fade into the distance. He clasped his hands and said goodbye to the home of Lord Buddha. 12 years earlier, Fa Xian had set out from Chang'an on his journey to India. Now, he had all he needed, and he was making his way back. He knew that he wouldn't be able to visit this country again, because his mission was to serve China. Out at sea, the weather turned violent. Would Fa Xian be able to survive the voyage back? Nothing was for certain. With the help of the monsoons, the ship moved eastward. However, after only 2 days of sailing, the ship encountered very strong winds. At this dangerous moment, Fa Xian threw all the objects he had with him into the ocean, except the Buddhist sutras he had gone to such trouble to obtain. The strong winds continued for 13 days and nights. The ship drifted with the waves. After having been at sea for over 100 days, they finally arrived in Javadvipa. Today, when one looks at the diary of Fa Xian's voyage home, there are many things that are confusing. The main one is, where is Javadvipa? Many scholars had long presumed that Javadvipa was either Java or Sumatra. However, this explanation isn't satisfactory because the distance simply doesn't compute. It is 1,800 nautical miles from Sri Lanka to Java. It would take a ship travelling under fair conditions about 15 days to complete this journey. Soon after he set sail, he encountered strong gales for 13 days and nights. While it's more likely that the stormy conditions like these would have hindered the progress of the voyage, is it beyond the realms of possibility that these strong winds in fact speeded him on his way home, landing him in Java earlier than anticipated? So, the question is, where was he during the other 90 days at sea? Fa Xian's book indicates that the people of Javadvipa were not Buddhists. This island has always been assumed to be Java or Sumatra, but some people argue that the Buddhist religion was practiced in these islands at that time. If so, Javadvipa could not have been Java or Sumatra. And if not, where was this island? Is it out of the question that the real location of Javadvipa lay far to the east, across the vast Pacific Ocean? After all, we know that in the year 1520, Ferdinand Magellan crossed the Pacific in just 90 days. Might not have Fa Xian achieved the same feat of seamanship? Nobody knows for sure, but it is at least an intriguing possibility. Whatever the facts of the matter, a record of Buddhist kingdoms suggests that Chinese mariners were making pioneering voyages on the high seas at a very early date. According to Fa Xian, he stayed in Javadvipa for 5 months. After that, he went aboard the repaired ship in May of 412 AD and continued his voyage to China. As the ship sailed onward, Fa Xian was getting ever closer to his country. But what he didn't know was that a life-threatening danger was imminent. In the darkness of night, a thunderstorm struck. The ship was in danger of capsizing in the rolling waves. The merchants on board were shocked and desperate. They prayed for God's protection. Fa Xian kept a close watch on his Buddhist sutras, and he prayed as well. However, there was no sign of the storm subsiding. It was at this point that a horrible plot unfolded. The merchants aboard who believed in Brahmanism thought that Fa Xian, a devoted Buddhist, could be the source of the disaster. They wondered if they could be saved if they threw him into the sea to pacify the ocean's anger. As Fa Xian was well versed in Sanskrit, he knew what they were planning to do. Fa Xian wasn't afraid to die, but his mind was on the Buddhist sutras that he had obtained from India over the course of 13 years. He knew that his fellow monks in China were desperately waiting for these texts. At this moment, the ship was totally out of control, and the Brahmin believers were about to take action. It was at this critical moment that a devout Chinese Buddhist stepped forward to protect Xian.
你们若扔下这位和尚，把我也扔下好了。你们不是要到中国去吗？中国的国王尊奉佛法，敬重僧人。如果你们这样做，国王是不会饶恕你们的。
The Brahmin believers, deterred by these words, decided not to throw Xian overboard. Soon, the waves subsided, and the ship was able to continue its voyage eastward. Xian survived, and he knew that he was close to home. Xian was on his way home with the sutras that he had collected. But out at sea, the weather was turbulent. Would he be able to complete the journey back to China? Following a 3-month voyage, the ship eventually arrived in China. It landed at Changwang Prefecture, which is near the present-day city of Qingdao. Mount Lao is located in East China. It was from here that many a voyage of exploration began. For example, many emperors from the Qin and Han dynasties sought immortality, and they believed that this elixir could only be found overseas. As a result, they sent numerous explorers abroad, never to return. In the year 412 AD, Mount Lao finally welcomed home the 75-year-old Xian. When he returned, Xian was alone. Over the course of 13 years, he had travelled across more than 30 countries, and he had braved numerous difficulties. Now, he was back home, and he had with him a treasure trove of Buddhist texts. Xian left China in his 60s. He didn't return until he was in his 70s. He accomplished a most difficult task. Not one to rest on his laurels, Xian knew that a new mission was about to begin. Back then, there was not a complete set of the Buddhist classics. In addition, mistranslated sutras had led to factionalism within the faith. Many monks and nuns were at a loss due to the lack of a definitive translation and understanding of the texts. According to historical records, Xian brought back 12 Buddhist classics spanning more than 60 volumes, totaling over 1 million words. Xian planned to translate them into Chinese and then spread them all over China. He felt that this was the best way to bring order to the Chinese Buddhist community. But this was easier said than done. Just where could he translate the Buddhist sutras? Xian was trying to figure this out. In the early 5th century, Chang'an had been devastated from years of conflict, and it looked quite different from the city Xian had left some 13 years before. By this time, the center of Buddhism in China was no longer based in Chang'an. In 412 AD, in order to accomplish the translation mission, Xian decided to travel to Jiankang, the capital of the Eastern Jin Dynasty and China's new center of Buddhism. At Daochang Temple in Jiankang, today's Nanjing, Fa Xian and Buddhabhadra, a monk from Nepal, worked together on the Buddhist sutras. It was to be a challenging task. Fa Xian knew that he didn't have long to live. He was racing against time. While he was busy translating, he gave lectures on Buddhism to his disciples. Fa Xian knew that a man's life was short, but Buddhism would live on, forever being passed from generation to generation. After 2 years of hard work, Fa Xian and Buddhabhadra completed the translation of the Mahasamgika Vinaya, one of the 5 precepts of Buddhism. This was a massive contribution to China, and it helped put Buddhist practices in order. Later, Fa Xian himself translated Nirvana Sutra into Chinese. The Nirvana Sutra not only carried Buddhism forward, it also opened up new vistas for the religion. In 414 AD, the 77-year-old Fa Xian left Daochang Temple for unknown reasons. He then began practicing Buddhism at Xian Temple in Jiangling. It was at this remote temple that Fa Xian wrote his most important work. It is entitled A Record of Buddhist Kingdoms. A Record of Buddhist Kingdoms is about Fa Xian's journey to the West to collect the Buddhist sutras. It details the hardships he suffered and the convictions of a devout monk. After completing A Record of Buddhist Kingdoms, Fa Xian knew he was dying. He prayed to the Lord Buddha for the last time. For a monk, the purpose of life is to be accomplished and become a Buddha themselves. Fa Xian had always been a very devout believer. In the year 423 AD, Fa Xian died at Xian Temple at the age of 86. Fa Xian became a Buddhist at 3 years of age. At 20, he became a monk. At 50, he traveled to Chang'an, and he started his westward journey at 62. He devoted his life to his beliefs, and he accomplished what no others had done. He reconciled everything he did in his life as being motivated by his Buddhist faith. In Chinese history, Fa Xian was not only an outstanding traveller and translator, but also a great pathfinder. His love of exploration expanded the horizons for Chinese Buddhists and gave rise to later expeditions seeking out even more Buddhist texts from the Western regions. 230 years later, and following in Fa Xian's footsteps, Xuanzang began his westward journey. In Kalutara near Colombo, Sri Lanka, there's a stone honouring Fa Xian. Also, in 1981, at the site of the Abhayagiri Vihara, Sri Lanka established the Fa Xian Stone Village in his honour, as well as to celebrate the friendship between Sri Lanka and China. This is Gungjia village in Shanxi province. It's the place where Fa Xian was born more than 1,000 years ago. Today, the village has dozens of families living in it. Most of the villagers know about Fa Xian and the major contributions to China that he made. For 1,600 years, Fa Xian has remained in people's minds for his accomplishments. His book, A Record of Buddhist Kingdoms, has been passed down from generation to generation, and it's been translated into many languages. It's a book that shows a unique side of the exchange between China and the outside world. This bronze statue of Fa Xian is located at Xiantang Mountain in Xiangyuan County. It was, of course, erected in his honor. Searching for the Buddhist sutras, Fa Xian provided us with not only vivid descriptions of his travels, but also the spirit with which the people of today should try and adhere to.
我穿越瀚海，西向天竺，寻求佛陀律法，历经雪山万仞，海浪滔天，终得血律东归。因为心中始终存着一个不变的志向，为了能够实现自己的理想，我永不言放弃。